Recently, there has been growing sentiment that somehow Pope Pius XII did not do enough to protest the Nazi regime, the Third Reich, that he did not do enough to help those who were being persecuted by the Nazis, and that in fact he was a collaborator and in some way responsible for Nazi atrocities. We'll find out today that this is absolutely not the case, and the exact opposite is true. I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. With me today to discuss the role of Pius XII during the Second World War is Father William Jenkins. Father Jenkins is a priest who has remained loyal to the traditions of the Church and celebrates the traditional Latin Mass exclusively. Father Jenkins, perhaps one of the statements I really recently came across, which is perhaps some more of a vitriolic remark on Pope Pius XII's role, came in a book called A Woman Rides the Beast by a Protestant author, Dave Hunt, who goes on to say that that Catholics have to accept the fact that, quote, the totalitarianism of their church was a major factor in preparing Catholics to embrace the Nazi regime, and this perhaps in a rather extreme way characterizes much of the attitude in the popular press of Pius XII's role during Nazi Germany's ascendancy. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as accurate or not?
No, it's absolutely not accurate. No, if Catholics of Germany embraced the Nazi regime, it was because they were prepared for a generation in advance to an extreme form of nationalism. In fact, Hitler deliberately cultivated this, and he ordered it to be cultivated among the clergy. And he tried to influence Catholic youth in all of their upbringing to have a devotion primarily to the Vaterland, and not to their Lord, to Jesus Christ. So he kind of reaped the harvest of what he'd sown. And he created a people who were very much mesmerized by himself. You know, he went for lessons to a professional magician and a mesmerist who was involved in magic and so on, to learn how to present himself. I mean, how to look, you know, how to gesture, so that he could actually sort of hypnotize the people. He was very much an actor. And it was all very contrived to achieve the effect of stirring up a people to a kind of frenzy. But remember now, the seeds were sown already at the Treaty of Versailles in the early 1920s, when the German people were reduced to absolute misery by the terms of peace by the Allies. And their suffering was a perfect opportunity for a madman like Hitler to appeal to their sense of pride and their desire to better their condition, and to get out of the poverty that had been forced upon them by the Allies.
It is clear that you know, the Church has condemned socialism. The Church has condemned this extreme form of nationalism, which divinizes, in fact, the Aryan race, which Hitler promoted, that somehow they are, you know, everyone else is an animal except the Aryan nation, in his view. To say that somehow the Church is responsible for that, you know, I think is irresponsible, to put it mildly. Moreover, the persecution of Catholics by Hitler is a well-documented fact. But what was the role? How did the Vatican deal with Hitler, with Mussolini, and with Stalin? I mean, obviously they were put in a situation where there are Catholics in all countries, especially Italy and Germany. And what did he do to oppose Nazi
Well, back in the late 20s and early 30s, no one believed that Hitler would amount to much, except perhaps Hitler. There were some who even believed that he was fronting for some other power within Germany, because they couldn't see this rather slight, although you know, a vociferous individual of modest talents and modest means amounting to much. But he was certainly a rabble-rouser, and he knew how to excite the crowd, and take advantage of the need and the misery of the people.
I can remember as a fact some very people now who are dead. A Jewish woman was a very good friend of ours. When I asked her, well, how come the Jews actually voted for Hitler? How come he was elected? And I said, especially when he wrote Mein Kampf. I'm not saying the Jews voted en masse for Hitler, but they did. And she said, well, no one took that seriously. We didn't even take him seriously, that he would amount to much. And that confirms that he was just, well, come on, Hitler?
Well, I'm sure as far as a lot of Germans were concerned, he was basically leading gigantic pep rallies for downtrodden people. In fact, the Pope Pius XI had warned that the Treaty of Versailles was going to provoke a terrible reaction in Germany, because the German people were not going to be kept down with a boot on their necks that long and suffer that. What was prescribed by the Treaty of Versailles without trying to make a comeback. And, I mean, his words were prophetic. His warning was prophetic. But Pope Pius XII was intimately knowledgeable of the German people. He was the apostolic nuncio to Germany in the 1920s. And he knew what the German people were suffering. He knew how they felt. He did his very, very best to keep Nazism at bay. He saw the rise of it. As I say, he and the other leaders of the world powers did not take Hitlerism very seriously. They didn't see National Socialism as becoming much of a force. But the audacity of Hitler turned the tide. And it was even the British diplomat who, after Hitler had gained such power, said to Pope Pius, I think it was even after the end of the Second World War, said to Pope Pius XII, you know, I never really thought Hitler would amount to anything. And Pope Pius XII said, well, you know, before the war, I didn't think he would either. But then I wasn't infallible. And when Hitler began, though, seizing power in Germany, and it looked as though, much to everyone's dismay, the German people were aligning themselves behind him, as much also because of the vacuum of power anywhere else in Germany. The church became very alarmed, and bishops made bold statements. Many of the Jesuits spoke out courageously against Hitlerism and National Socialism, said it was absolutely incompatible with Christianity, the Catholic religion. Hitler came to regard the church as a terrible enemy, one of his most fearsome enemies. He denounced the church. He said he would crush the church as he would crush a toad under his boot. And eventually he found that it wasn't that easy to do. Pope Pius XII, or the man who would become Pope Pius XII, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, was actually working in the diplomatic corps of the Vatican. And he was under Cardinal Gaspari. And he was trying to draft a diplomatic settlement with Hitler, to try to keep the man at bay, to try to keep the worst from coming out in him. And that's all it was. It was an attempt to bind him down by the terms of an agreement before he could do the damage that he was capable of. But of course we saw that Pope Pius XII's efforts, even as Cardinal Pacelli, were thwarted by movements in Italy by Mussolini and in Germany by Hitler.
There's the popular train of thought that says that, basically Pius XII did nothing against Nazi Germany. What actions did he take once he became Pope to try to contain Hitler or somehow speak out against him?
Well, he had to remain officially neutral. The Vatican's role was to be officially neutral. And yet, in 1,001 ways, he denounced Nazism and fascism, and he did whatever he could to rescue those who were the victims of fascism and Nazism. And it seems so ironic today that especially there are Jewish leaders who claim that Pope Pius XII failed as a pope and that he actually favored Nazism. It seems so ironic today that this charge would be leveled against him when the Jews back in the 1940s and 50s praised Pope Pius XII for having courageously defended them and harbored and sheltered them throughout the worst days of danger, and even put the church at risk to do so. I mean, we have even Catholics who have jumped on the bandwagon to attack Pope Pius XII and his character. We have a book by John Cornwell, who we're told was a devout Catholic. In fact, he was not a devout Catholic, but this is how he's
Gives him more
portrayed.
credibility, yeah.
And he wrote a book called Hitler's Pope against Pope Pius XII. This man does nothing but a hatchet job on Pope Pius XII's character, and again, he claims to be a Catholic. But he's not. He, in fact, is simply attacking the church because he knows it sells now. It's very popular to launch these attacks. And, in fact, this magazine, Brill's Content, had an article devoted to an upcoming book by a man named Ronald Reichlach, or Reichlach, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, who was on the law faculty at the University of Mississippi. And in this article, Ronald Reichlach shows how unobjective John Cornwell's book is, attacking Pius XII's character. And just recently now we have a famous man named Gary Wills. Remember Gary Wills, the author? He writes a book called Papal Sin, which is written up in the New York Times Book Review. His review is entitled Acting Fallible. Recent popes, Gary Wills says, have made a series of disastrous decisions and stuck by them. These are all nothing but base hatchet jobs on the reputation of the Pope, and in fact the whole purpose is to attack the church, really. Let's face it, they're trying to attack the church through, by attacking Pius XII. But if you read the testimonies of the Jewish people after World War II, or even during World War II, about what Pius XII was doing to help them, you wonder, how can the Jews today deny what their own ancestors said? Those who actually suffered in the camps, who were rescued by Pius XII, are the Jews who are attacking Pius XII's character today saying that their ancestors were liars? Or are they saying they just didn't know what they were saying? Or they were somehow at fault for praising a man whom they now condemn?
What were some of the things that were said by the Jews who actually suffered during the war about Pius XII?
Well, for example, in the early days of the war, Albert Einstein wrote, and actually his statements appear in Time magazine for December 23rd, 1940, on page 38, I should say. And this is what Einstein had to say. He said, "Being a lover of freedom, when the revolution came in Germany, I looked to the universities to defend it, knowing that they had always boasted of their devotion to the cause of truth. But no, the universities immediately were silenced. Then I looked to the great editors of the newspapers, whose flaming editorials in days gone by had proclaimed their love of freedom. But they, like the universities, were silenced in a few short weeks. Only the church," now these are the words of Albert Einstein, December 23rd, 1940, "only the church stood squarely across the path of Hitler's campaign for suppressing the truth. I never had any special interest in the church before. But now I feel a great affection and admiration because the church alone has had the courage and persistence to stand for intellectual truth and moral freedom. I am forced, thus, to confess that what I once despised, I now praise unreservedly." Words of Albert Einstein.
Striking.
Rather strong statement by a gentleman like this. And in fact, there is, in another similar statement, Einstein referred explicitly to the Catholic Church, and this is in the book by a man named Pius Lapide. Again, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, Pinchas, E is the initial, and Lapide, Lapide. He was an Israeli consul. He wrote a book entitled Three Popes and the Jews, published by Hawthorne Books in New York in 1967. This was a critical examination of Pope Pius XII's behavior during the war, specifically with regard to the Jews. And according to the research of this Israeli consul, the Catholic Church under Pope Pius XII was instrumental in saving 860,000 Jews from Nazi death camps. Could Pius have saved more lives by speaking out more forcefully? According to Lapide, the concentration camp prisoners did not want Pius to speak out openly. As one jurist from the Nuremberg trials said on WNBC in New York in 1964, and this is a quote, "Any words of Pius XII directed against a madman like Hitler would have brought on an even worse catastrophe and accelerated the massacre of Jews and priests." And priests were being massacred as well as Jews. But Pius was not silent. He did speak out. In fact, the New York Times editorial pages carried, in 1940 and 41, the Pope's sermons for Christmas. And these statements went all over the world. And unmistakably, Pope Pius XII condemned Hitlerism and racism and Nazism. Lapide notes a book written by an earlier Jewish historian, a man named Genoa Levi. This book was entitled "The Church Did Not Keep Silent." And Levi admits that everyone, including himself, could have done more. And if we condemn Pius, then justice would demand condemning everyone. And he concluded by quoting from the Talmud that says, "Whoever preserves one life, it is accounted to him by Scripture as if he had preserved a whole world." And he says that Pope Pius XII deserves a memorial forest of 860,000 trees in the hills of Judea, as a testimony to what he did to save the lives of Jews during the war. These are things you don't hear about. Yes. And yet the same journalists who are reporting all the awful things about Pope Pius XII, a lot of them calumnies and slander, have access to what their own fellow journalists wrote just a generation or two ago.
To maintain a convenient silence. Mm-hmm. You're watching What Catholics Believe. We're discussing Pius. Father Jenkins.
Lapide, by the way, continues. He says, Pius knew that every time he spoke out against Hitler, the Nazis could retaliate against the prisoners. And that's in fact what they did. When the bishops of Holland spoke out against Nazism, the next day 40,000 people, 40,000 Jews were rounded up. They even went into the Catholic convents and took the Jewish nuns, the Jewish converts to Catholicism, took them out. That's how Edith Stein perished in a prisoner of war camp, or I should say in a concentration camp, excuse me. The Nazis were absolutely ruthless. Listen to what the 1996 Grolier Multimedia Encyclopedia says now. For whatever authority it has, this is what it says about the Church under Pope Pius XII. Wishing to preserve Vatican neutrality, fearing reprisals, and realizing his impotence to stop the Holocaust, Pius nonetheless acted on an individual basis to save many Jews and others with church ransoms, documents, and asylum. And then Lapide goes on to explain the charity and work of Pope Pius XII during World War II so impressed the chief rabbi of Rome, Israel Zoli, that in 1944 he was open to the grace of God which led him into the Catholic faith. As his baptismal name, he took the same one Pius had, Eugenio, as his own. And later, Israel Eugenio Zoli wrote a book entitled Why I Became a Catholic. Excuse me, this book was recently reprinted under the title of Before the Dawn. And Zoli was the chief rabbi in the city of Rome during World War II. He was the one who was asked to go to seek help from Pope Pius XII in the Vatican when the chief, I think it was SS officer in Rome, demanded, what was it, 20 kilograms of gold, was that it, or 50 kilograms of gold to be delivered, or 300 Jews were going to be rounded up and taken away to the death camps. And so they didn't have that much gold on hand, so this rabbi went to Pope Pius XII and obtained from him in the course of the following days, I think so many kilograms of gold that came from the church's own sacred vessels and donations of Catholics throughout Rome to save the Jewish people. He writes about this.
It's very moving.
In his book, Before the Dawn. And he offered to sign a receipt, in fact. The Pope said that wasn't necessary. He was so moved by this, he was so moved by the church's charity, that after the war, he became a Catholic. But he didn't become a Catholic just as kind of a payoff to Pope Pius XII. In his book, he explains that he was
the chief rabbi of Rome,
Israel Zoli. He says he was moved to become a Catholic slowly over time because he accepted the truth of the faith. And he began to see that Jesus Christ truly was the Messiah. But one thing held him back, and that was the lack of charity that he perceived in the Catholic people. Well, that was destroyed by the example of Pope Pius XII. His perception of the lack of charity was overcome by the charity of Pope Pius XII. And when he was baptized, Zoli was baptized, he took Pius XII's own baptismal name as a tribute to all that he had done for his Zoli's people during the war to save them.
That's amazing. And of course, this is virtually unknown today. One never reads about this. That's very moving.
Well, I'd recommend this book.
What was the name of the book, Father? The Dawn?
It's been republished as Before the Dawn. It's actually made available by a group called the Remnant of Israel, Jews who have accepted Christ. And they're very conservative, they're very pro-life, they're down in Kentucky. I think it's New Hope, Kentucky. They have this book available. In fact, Israel Zoli, now Eugene Zoli, dedicated a chapter toward the end of his book to the charity of Pope Pius XII.
And who is the publisher? Is there?
I'm not sure who the recent publisher of the new publication is.
Okay.
That I don't even know that. But it can be found. I myself did some research and found it Before the Dawn. And it's also interesting to read what the New York Times was saying about what Pope Pius XII was doing. We have his editorials on Christmas Day, 1941 and 1942. The New York Times published on December 25th, 1941, in the late day edition, on the editorial page, "The voice of Pius XII is a lonely voice in the silence and darkness enveloping Europe this Christmas. He is about the only ruler left on the continent of Europe who dares to raise his voice at all. The Pope put himself squarely against Hitlerism. He left no doubt that the Nazi aims are also irreconcilable with his own conception of a Christian peace." And a year later, December 25th, 1942, "This Christmas, more than ever, he is a lonely voice crying out in the silence of a continent. Pope Pius expresses as passionately as any leader on our side the war aims of the struggle for freedom when he says that those who aim at building a new world must fight for free choice of government and religious order. They must refuse that the state should make of individuals a herd of whom the state disposes as if they were lifeless things." These are rather strong statements coming from the New York Times editorials in tribute to Pope Pius XII.
My understanding is, Father, too, that we've seen now Albert Einstein and Israel Zoli, the former chief rabbi of Rome, and their defense and praise of the Church and Pope Pius XII during those difficult times, but that Golda Meir, former Prime Minister of Israel, also had some very positive things to say about.
She certainly did. As a matter of fact, I'd get to that, and maybe I should get to that by mentioning the fact that her statement was published in a publication of the Catholic Church, the National Catholic Welfare Conference in 1963. But the author of the statement was a high-ranking official of the B'nai B'rith.
Oh, my goodness.
He was in charge of the International Intercultural Affairs Bureau of the International B'nai B'rith. His name was Joseph Lichten. Probably the only time the Catholic Church has published a statement made by a leader in the B'nai B'rith. This was in 1963. It was called A Question of Judgment, Pius XII and the Jews. Why 1963? Because the play by Rolf Hochhuth, the young Jewish playwright of Germany, attacking Pius XII had just come out and was making international headlines. And this man, Joseph Lichten, who knew the truth about Pius XII and knew he was not anti-Semitic and knew he had helped the Jews, decided to speak up against his own fellow Jew, this young man who was out to assassinate Pius XII's character. Lichten wrote some marvelous things about Pius XII in gratitude to him. For example, in this A Question of Judgment, Pius XII and the Jews, Joseph Lichten wrote this: "There is considerable documentation in support of Pope Pius's fear that a formal statement would worsen and not improve conditions for the persecuted. Ernst von Weizsäcker, the German ambassador to the Vatican during World War II, wrote in his memoirs," and he quotes it, "Not even institutions of worldwide importance, such as the International Red Cross or the Roman Catholic Church, saw fit to appeal to Hitler in a general way on behalf of the Jews, or to call openly on the sympathies of the world. It was precisely because they wanted to help the Jews that these organizations refrained from making any general and public appeals, for they were afraid that they would injure rather than help the Jews thereby. The retaliations were swift and horrible. In fact, the Vatican was made aware of the fact that if they dared speak out, the retaliations would be immediate and would be horrible. They would hurt the people they were trying to help." And Joseph Lichten goes on, "Pius XII's silence, let us remember, extended to persecutions of Catholics as well as Jews, precisely because of the fear of reprisals."
You've been watching What Catholics Believe.